Good morning, everyone. Today, Katie and I will be presenting on the journey women in Canada had to embark on to receive the vote and political representation. Canada's earliest efforts to bring about women's suffrage were led by a diverse movement of women and men across the country who campaigned for women's right to vote on equal terms as men. Canada's diverse women's movement, which sought equality in matters from education to employment to politics, were often controversial. Many Canadians insisted that the woman's proper place was in the home, where they supported their families and man's career. Despite this, many women entered the paid workforce in the early 20th century. However, they still encountered economic, educational, and legal restrictions. Political equality was vital for improving their lives. Suffragists persevered, confronting governments, writing articles, presenting petitions, organizing parades, staging mock parliaments, and doing much more across the country to get their message through to the citizens and the government. While these strategies did bring about early success in Western Canada, the road to full enfranchisement was a long struggle. Women were granted the federal vote in 1918, making a significant step towards Canada's acceptance of what is now considered a universal human right. However, many intersectional groups of women, such as Indigenous and Asian women, were excluded for decades. The women's suffrage movement marks a critical chapter in human rights history in Canada as it redefined gender roles and reduced political inequality for some women. The first part of this presentation will speak specifically to the early part of the suffragist achievements, commonly referred to as first wave feminism, and the second part of this presentation will focus more on the various groups of women that were excluded and marginalized from this group, focusing more on second to third wave feminism. So we hear the term first wave feminism quite often, but what exactly is it? First wave feminism was where early activists focused on improving women's role in public life. The primary focus was on receiving the vote and achieving political representation in parliament. The early idea of feminism was based in maternal feminism, which was the idea that women were natural caregivers and mothers of the nation, who should participate in public life because of their perceived propensity for decisions that will result in the good care of society. They wanted to improve maternal care, infant care, and public health, as well as end child labor. The temperance movement, which was abstaining from alcohol, was very important at this time as well. Women wanted to vote to improve the world and improve their ability to raise their children safely. These early suffragists, generally affluent white women, were interested in advocating for the franchise for all women in the country. Voting was dependent on property rights, so middle class white women in Canada who had property were demanding the right to vote, but the fact that they owned it was still premised on the dispossession of lands from Indigenous peoples. Different marginalized groups were also organizing separately from white women at this time, which Katie will speak to in more detail later on. The most effective way to encapsulate the entirety of the women's early suffrage achievements is by laying it out in a timeline, which will be depicted over the next few slides. However, for the sake of time, I will only be highlighting the important moments on this timeline. In 1876, the first suffrage organization is founded in Canada. The Toronto Women's Literary Guild is founded by Dr. Emily Stowe and is fighting for women's rights, including access to higher education and the right to vote. In 1883, it becomes the Canadian Women's Suffrage Association. In 1885, the Federal Electoral Franchise Act is invoked. This act defines those permitted to vote as male persons. Prime Minister John A. Macdonald considers spreading the vote to unmarried or widows with properties, but the opposition shuts the idea down and the proposals are dropped. In 1893, the first mock parliament is held in Winnipeg. When a petition from pioneering Dr. Amelia Yeomans and the Manitoba Women's Christian Temperance Movement is ignored, they staged the nation's first mock parliament with men appealing for the vote and women denying it to them. Other mock parliaments follow in Toronto in 1896 and Vancouver and Victoria in 1910. In 1895, a motion for women's suffrage is first presented in federal parliament. Saskatchewan MP Nicholas Flood Davin introduces a motion to allow women the vote. Opponents insist that a woman's proper sphere is the home, and his motion is defeated. In 1914, Manitoba suffragists appear before the Legislative Assembly in Manitoba, and Nellie McClung hosts her mock parliament. A delegation of suffragists gathers at the assembly, and Nellie McClung famously demands, "Give us our due." Conservative Premier Rodman Rublin replies that most women don't want the vote. So she and other suffragists hold a mock parliament in Winnipeg, which McClung presents a massive takedown of Premier Roblin, addressing men seeking the franchise in front of a packed, laughing audience. The event helps make the women's suffrage movement more politically and publicly acceptable. In 1917, BC and Ontario get the vote, and the Wartime Elections Act is invoked. The federal vote is extended to women in the armed forces and female relatives of military men, while disenfranchising citizens of enemy alien birth. It disenfranchises some women previously enfranchised by provinces who would have otherwise been able to vote in the 1917 election. In 1918, Nova Scotia gets the vote, and Canadian women get the federal vote. So females aged 21 and over, not excluded under racial and Indigenous grounds, become eligible to vote in the federal election, whether or not they are enfranchised by their province to do so. In 1920, the Dominion Elections Act is invoked, and Angus MacPhail was Canada's first female elected MP. So Angus MacPhail was from the riding Grey South East in Guelph, Ontario. And the Dominion Elections Act enfranchises many who were disenfranchised during the First World War. However, if you were disenfranchised by race, you still could not vote. In 1922, 500 suffragists confront Premier, and PEI gets the vote. Liberal Premier Taschereau states that women will not get the provincial vote as long as he is in office. Key suffragists emerge in Quebec from this encounter. In 1929, we have the famous Persons Case. The Imperial Privy Council of England rules that women are legally persons, reversing a Supreme Court ruling of Canada. Women are now able to hold seats in the Canadian Senate. The famous 5 who pursued this case to the highest court are key suffragists in Canada. In 1934, we have the Dominions Franchise Act. This act specifically disqualifies Inuit and Status Indians from voting in the federal election, but makes an exception for Status Indian veterans. In 1947, we have the Citizenship Act. This act extends the vote to all Chinese Canadians and South Asian Canadians, both men and women, but continues to exclude Indigenous peoples and Japanese Canadians. In 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is issued, and the Elections Act is revised. Article 21 of the Declaration states that elections shall be by universal and equal suffrage. So the Elections Act is revised, where it removes race as a ground of exclusion, except for Indigenous peoples. Finally, in 1951, Northwest Territories gets the vote. So the people in Northwest Territories, specifically women, could vote federally before this, but in 1951, Northwest Territories had their first provincial election, and so this is why they were the last province to formally give women the vote. Through the timeline of early suffragist achievements, it's quite apparent that there was success for affluent white women's ability to receive the vote and pave the way for political representation. However, as mentioned earlier, not all women were included and got the vote. I will now pass it off to Katie, who will speak more about second and third wave feminism and these marginalized groups of women's struggles to achieve the vote and political representation in Canada.
Hello, okay. So after the initial suffragette movement of the first wave of feminism, new waves began to emerge to address and fight against other issues that women were facing. Not all women had originally been given the right to vote. It would not be until the 1980s that BIPOC women were all allowed to vote. In regard to other forms of political participation, the second and third waves of feminism were focused on more women-led legislation that actually represented what women want. An example of this would be the mass protests that emerged for the right to an abortion. Next slide, please. So as I explained before, while the first wave of feminism brought voting rights to many women across Canada, there was still a significant number of women who were not able to vote. Black women, Indigenous women, and other women of color overall faced discrimination in different areas of Canadian society. Political participation was not something that was immediately accessible to these women. Black women were technically allowed to start voting in 1918. However, due to other racialized factors that existed, there were still more barriers that they faced compared to white women. For different Asian groups in Canada, as Brianna talked about earlier, the right to vote took much longer. Japanese and Chinese Canadians were unable to vote in many provincial elections up until the late 1940s. Activists like the ones in this photo here were going to government officials directly to ask for the right to vote for their communities. They were denied this right until 1949, when they were all given the right to vote by the federal government. Other groups of women at this time, including those with disabilities and who belonged to certain religious sects, were not granted the right to vote until the 1980s. Next slide, please. So Indigenous groups of Turtle Island had already created a system of democracy before colonial rule had taken over. In this system of governments, women were considered to be extremely valuable in society, and their opinions were very important in decision-making processes. As the formation of Canada took place, Indigenous women became part of the patriarchal society that had taken over. So this meant that they were not valued in the same way that men were. At the same time, Indigenous women were also not treated equally to white women. Because the government had a lot of control over these groups, they could dictate their voting and participation rights. After the installment of the Indian Act, the only way that Indigenous people overall could vote in Canada would be if they gave up their status as an Indigenous person. This means that they would become Canadian citizens and not have the same rights that they did under the Indian Act. It would not be until the 1960s that Indigenous women would be able to vote in Canada. Next slide, please. So, as we already have discussed in this class, intersectionality played a major role in the second and third wave of feminism. To give a quick recap, Kimberly Crenshaw created this term as a response to the way that white women were controlling the feminist movements during the 1980s. Intersectionality allows there to be a focus on other factors that affect a person's life that connect with one another. While BIPOC women were able to relate to issues that were being brought up in feminist movements, like fighting for the right to abortion, there was still not enough inclusivity taking place to fight for issues that directly affected non-white women. For the example we focused on in this presentation, the right to vote was a major issue that the first wave feminists were focused on. When these white feminists achieved their goal, they did not continue to fight for racialized women to have these rights as well. The rise of intersectionality meant that all women could fight together for different issues that affected them and affected their political participation in Canada. Next slide, please. So to conclude, the right to vote in Canada shows the progress of how women have fought for their ability to participate in politics. While there are growing numbers of women becoming more involved in all levels of political practices now, there are still barriers that exist at the individual and societal level that exist to prevent that equality. As feminism is moving into its fourth wave, it is important to look back at the history of the right to vote and learn from both the progress and the mistakes that were made along the way. It is important to remember that as we continue to achieve equality for women's participation in politics, we focus with an intersectional lens. And that concludes our presentation. Thank you for listening.